Oh yes, but it goes much deeper than that. The reality, unfortunately, is that because of this, Madame Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister ended up giving an answer based on possible inadvertent misinformation. I've just come from the chamber after listening to the Home Secretary, and the most extraordinary thing was seeing every Labour MP stand up to congratulate her, praising the decision to hold a national inquiry. These are the very same Labour MPs who, only months ago, insisted such an inquiry wasn't necessary and even voted against a Tory amendment to have one. The hypocrisy, deceit, and outright dishonesty of it all is staggering. Lee Anderson and I were sitting there, utterly shell-shocked. And this isn't just about Keir Starmer's latest U-turn. It's about something much bigger. I don't believe the country will let this be brushed aside. This is a defining moment for all of us. Lee Anderson even stood up to recommend that Maggie Oliver should lead the inquiry, but I was disappointed that this wasn't taken up. Alongside his chancellor, he's undermined public confidence in the United Kingdom. It's deeply embarrassing, especially given they were elected on promises of ending cronyism, delivering integrity, accountability, and genuine public service. There is now a gaping void on the right of British politics, and we intend to fill it. This is now a bridgehead secured in Parliament. It may only be 4 or 5 MPs, but the noise they intend to make will far outweigh their numbers, driving forward what they call a people's revolt toward the next general election, where they plan to be the real opposition to Keir Starmer. Starmer thought he had everything under control until Richard Tice dropped a political bomb. Now Labour is fraying at the seams. Migrant buses are arriving in its strongholds. Councils are in chaos. Voters are furious. And Starmer himself is panicking on live television. The most shocking part? Every move is completely legal. This could be the moment that changes British politics forever. Tice didn't just issue a warning. He launched a missile. Without any leaks to the press or opposition, Reform UK quietly began implementing what could be the most disruptive immigration strategy in modern politics. Migrants once concentrated in overburdened, working-class towns like Dover and Rochdale are now being relocated directly into Labour and Lib Dem council areas, places that loudly declared refugees welcome, but had never faced the real-world impact. This is no symbolic gesture. Reform councils are exercising local authority rights, rejecting new asylum housing contracts, and physically transferring illegal migrants into opposition territories. The effect has been seismic. Lincolnshire led this charge within days of taking local control. Reform leaders shut down asylum hotel projects, overhauled council structures, and blocked migrant accommodations. Behind the scenes, legal teams moved with speed, tearing up contracts and issuing cease and desist notices. Letters went out to the Home Office, and convoys of buses began rolling not toward the usual processing towns, but straight into the heart of Labour territory. The move landed like a political bomb, sending Starmer's inner circle into chaos. Panic rippled through Labour offices as inboxes overflowed with angry messages from upper middle class constituents, people who had once proudly championed open borders but were now living with the reality. Local councillors were blindsided, never consulted or prepared, and overnight, furious town hall meetings erupted. The questions came fast. Why here? Why now? Why weren't we told? The very voters who had supported Labour's immigration stance were suddenly confronting its consequences, and they didn't like what they saw. Reform UK's long-standing accusation that Labour preached compassion while shifting the costs elsewhere was no longer theoretical. Richard Tice didn't just talk about hypocrisy. He dragged it into the daylight and dumped it on Starmer's doorstep. The timing was ruthless. With a general election looming and Labour trying to appear as the responsible alternative to the Tories, Reform strike couldn't be ignored. Mainstream media tried to soften the blow, but the images were everywhere: buses unloading, residents shouting, councillors floundering. The chaos was undeniable, the fallout inevitable. Under pressure from reporters, Starmer lashed out, branding reform as dangerous, inhumane, and reckless. But his response lacked conviction. No passion, no solutions, just visible panic. Voters saw the fear behind his words. And more importantly, they saw something else. Reform was doing what neither Labour nor the Conservatives had dared, forcing real consequences for failed immigration policies. With one council's decision, a blueprint was set in motion. Dozens of reform-led councils began mirroring the approach, reviewing similar policies, preparing legal challenges, and mapping out Labour and Lib Dem districts that had long backed open border policies. A digital, color-coded map circulated internally, pinpointing exactly where migrants would be redirected. The message was clear. You supported mass migration. Now you face the consequences. Tice delivered the plan with calm precision in a viral interview. If they want open borders, they can live with the result. We're done dumping migrants into communities that never voted for it. There was no ranting, no theatrics, just calculated, unflinching strategy. The reaction was explosive. Reform UK's online support surged, clips and commentary flooded social media, and neglected towns rallied behind them. Volunteers mobilized, legal experts pledged pro bono assistance, and even disillusioned Tory voters began endorsing reform's bold stance. What was once dismissed as a fringe protest group had transformed into a political insurgency armed with legal muscle, grassroots momentum, and a plan designed to pierce Labour's weak points. Westminster felt the shockwaves. Lib Dems scrambled with hollow statements about due process, but footage of migrants arriving in their own districts spread fast, sparking public outrage. Local leaders faltered. The Conservatives, meanwhile, were paralyzed. Sunak's government left watching reform execute the promises they had long abandoned. The promises never materialized. Tory MPs began whispering about defections, alliances, and how Reform UK had stolen the law and order narrative right from under their noses. At the center of the storm stood Keir Starmer, once the man who vowed to restore decency to politics, now reduced to firefighting, as every speech, interview, and policy was overshadowed by a single brutal fact. Richard Tice had beaten him to the punch, using Labour's own words and phone policies against them. The fallout from Reform UK's first offensive was swift and unforgiving. As buses carrying migrants arrived in Labour and Lib Dem strongholds, the moral high ground crumbled almost overnight. Immigration, once a distant statistic confined to working-class towns, was suddenly on the doorstep of quiet suburban Labour neighborhoods. Those who had marched for refugee rights posted "No human is illegal" and cheered Starmer's immigration. Rhetoric now found asylum centers opening near their children's schools, and their compassion evaporated. Years of carefully cultivated empathy collapsed under the weight of proximity. Starmer, caught in a political trap he never saw coming, faced no safe path forward. Condemning reform risked hypocrisy, but endorsing migrant redistribution risked rebellion within his party. So he stalled, issued vague platitudes, and prayed for the headlines to shift. They didn't. Each day brought a fresh crisis, like the Oxford Labour-led council descending into chaos after receiving just 2 busloads. Without warning, Brighton was told to receive large numbers of asylum seekers, sparking outrage. In the city, Lib Dem councillors accused Reform of engaging in political terrorism, while their own residents demanded answers on housing shortages, rising crime, and overcrowded schools. Even in Cambridge and Louslong, considered strongholds of progressive ideals, the mood shifted sharply. Town halls overflowed with anger as parents, pensioners, and lifelong Labour supporters lined up to demand one thing: why didn't you prepare us for this? The uncomfortable truth was that Labour never thought they would have to. Their immigration policies were crafted for speeches in Westminster, not for the realities of everyday communities. Richard Tice understood this perfectly. That was the trap. For decades, the strain of mass migration had fallen most heavily on working-class towns like Doncaster, Hull, and Oldham, while politicians in gated estates and leafy suburbs delivered lectures untouched by the consequences. Reform's manoeuvre wasn't just logistical. It was psychological, forcing labor to face its own policies without the safety of distance. Suddenly, there was no spin, no buffer, and no scapegoat. Keir Starmer, once the unflappable barrister with polished soundbites, began to show cracks. His press conferences turned defensive, his interviews tense. The breaking point came during a Sky News segment, when he was pressed repeatedly on whether labor councils would keep accepting migrants redirected by reform. He dodged the question twice, but on the third attempt, he snapped, condemning the policy as vile. It was branded a betrayal of British values, but by then the damage was irreversible, and his anger only reinforced Ty's point. Behind closed doors, Labour HQ was in freefall. Senior advisors leaked accounts of an apocalyptic atmosphere, and Starmer, reportedly furious, not only at reform, but at his own team's failure to foresee the backlash, presided over strategy meetings that quickly degenerated into blame games. Backbench MPs warned that once safe, Labour seats were no longer secure. Councillors threatened to resign, and in one now notorious meeting, a party official issued a stark warning. If we don't get control of this, we're going to lose the red wall all over again, this time for good. While Starmer scrambled to contain the internal collapse, Reform UK pressed the attack. Buoyed by early legal victories in Lincolnshire, their lawyers expanded the campaign, filing freedom of information requests to uncover which Labour councils had signed contracts for asylum accommodations. That data was then weaponized, publicized, targeted, and used to justify further relocations, leaving councils that once quietly backed open border policies besieged both administratively and politically. Reform's moves were calculated. They didn't need to win the nation, only to shatter the illusion that Labour's immigration stance was workable, moral, or fair, and it was working. Meanwhile, the Conservative camp remained silent. Rishi Sunak and his cabinet appeared paralyzed, their inaction exposing not only Labour's weaknesses, but the Tories' own cowardice, after years of promising border control, deportation flights, and an end to the hotel racket promises they had never kept. Ty's bold, unapologetic moves made his opponents appear weak, and the impact was immediate. Tory MPs, anxious about losing more ground, began quietly praising Reform UK's tactics in private, with a few even hinting at switching parties or forming alliances in upcoming local elections. This was no longer just a political tussle. It had become a full-scale rebellion against the status quo. Once dismissed as a mere protest vote, Reform UK had evolved into a potent force, rallying disillusioned voters and frustrated politicians around a blunt, uncheckable message: if you voted for this, you own it. What made the shift even more dangerous for the establishment was the grassroots response. Reform wasn't simply pushing policies. They were igniting a movement. Neglected communities began organizing. Grassroots groups sprang up overnight, offering legal aid to reform-led councils, coordinating voter registration drives, and flooding local radio with support. In some towns, reform candidates reported a tenfold surge in membership applications. Mainstream media tried to discredit them as racist, dangerous, or extremist, but the smears failed to stick. People were exhausted from being shamed for asking questions, tired of being ignored, and weary of bearing the cost of elite policies. Now, they had a political vehicle with bite. Starmer's nightmare was no longer hypothetical, it was unfolding in real time. Every attempt to regain control floundered. Press releases came across as desperate, and polling began to shift. In areas where reform redirected migrants, local backing surged. Starmer's team scrambled to pivot, talking about fairer systems, community consultation, and balanced policies, but the public had stopped listening. Reform had already rewritten the rules. Calls for greater consultation were growing louder, as critics questioned why the very politicians who had welcomed migrants into the country seemed unwilling to host them in their own neighborhoods. The silence in response was deafening, and hanging over the entire debate like a gathering storm was Nigel Farage, still silent, still out of sight, yet unmistakably present in everyone's mind. His quiet wasn't absence, it was anticipation. Richard Tice may have struck the match, but Farage was the detonation waiting to happen. What began as a bold local move in Lincolnshire had snowballed into a full-scale political reckoning. Reform UK was no longer playing defense. They were setting the agenda. One by one, reform-controlled councils adopted identical strategies, rejecting asylum hotel contracts, evicting existing migrant accommodations, and redirecting new arrivals into Labour and Liberal Democrat strongholds. The buses kept rolling, the pressure kept rising, and Keir Starmer's options were rapidly disappearing. Inside Labour, loyalty was crumbling. Councillors in key constituencies refused to comply, while local MPs pleaded with party leadership to halt reform's advance. But Starmer had no control over council authority. Reform had identified the legal loopholes, weaponized local governance, and executed their plan with ruthless precision. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. In reality, it was a meticulously coordinated political offensive, and Labour was losing ground fast. By the time reform buses arrived in Oxford, Cambridge, and parts of Greater Manchester, the message was unmistakable. This wasn't political theater, it was a revolution. The stunned faces of Liberal Democrat councillors, as dozens of migrants arrived without warning, told the whole story. In one heated Surrey meeting, a Lib Dem official was even caught on camera shouting at Reform's legal team accused opponents of sabotage. And while a clip of the confrontation went viral, it didn't land the way the Liberal Democrats had hoped. To the public, it showed a rattled politician struggling to reconcile their open border stance with the visible consequences of it. The most liked comment under the video summed up the sentiment bluntly. "You voted for this, now live with it." Reform UK showed no sign of slowing. Richard Tice doubled down in a follow-up press briefing, flanked by legal documents, council orders, and maps of upcoming target areas. "This is what action looks like," he declared, adding that those who supported mass immigration would now have the chance to practice what they preach. No more dumping, no more lies. This, he said, was the new standard, and they were just getting started. His calm, unwavering delivery struck harder than any shouting match. It wasn't just what he said, but the confidence, clarity, and unapologetic energy that made the political establishment seem outdated and powerless. In Westminster, cracks began to appear within Starmer's team. Confidential leaks revealed Labour's internal polling had collapsed in key red wall seats, with once safe areas now swinging toward reform by double digits. Strategists urged Starmer to pivot, tighten his messaging, propose restrictions, or at least project a tougher stance on migrant housing, but he was trapped. A harder line risked alienating his progressive base. A softer one meant bleeding working-class voters. The man once seen as the pragmatic alternative to Tory chaos now appeared cornered and indecisive, each move by reform tightening the political noose. Meanwhile, reform-led councils pressed ahead with their plans. Public bulletins began circulating, revealing that Labour-controlled authorities had previously approved migrant accommodation deals without consulting the public. Records, meeting minutes, emails, and planning permissions were plastered across social media, sparking outrage that spread with lightning speed. Voters quickly realized they had been excluded from decisions directly affecting their communities, and trust evaporated overnight. A single tweet from a Reform supporter in Blackpool remarking, "Funny how it's only wrong when they show up in your neighborhood." Reform is just evening the scales, garnered over 1 million views in less than a day. The replies poured in, angry, supportive, and fiercely energized. The debate had shifted. This was no longer just about migrants. It had become a symbolic war between two Britons. The forgotten working-class towns bearing the brunt of globalist policies, and the progressive elites who designed those policies from a comfortable distance. For the first time in decades, the working class had a party that wasn't just speaking for them, but taking action on their behalf. Reform's message was sharp, simple, and ruthlessly effective. No more safe zones for hypocrites. Local Labour MPs began cancelling public appearances. Protests erupted outside town halls. In one striking incident, a Labour councillor was booed out of a community meeting by his own constituents after refusing to condemn new migrant allocations. The betrayal felt deeply personal. Communities that had stood by Labour through economic hardship, Brexit turmoil, and years of party infighting now felt abandoned and deceived. Reform was there to catch them. Meanwhile, its internal operation grew increasingly focused, and aggressive new candidates were trained, legal teams expanded, and private funding surged, bolstered by anonymous backers. Business donors, once loyal to the Tories, began redirecting their funds into Reform's campaign coffers. Behind the scenes, Nigel Farage was quietly working the phones, contacting influential media allies, retired MPs, and seasoned political strategists. Though silent in public, his influence was unmistakable, and every sign pointed toward an inevitable escalation. A full-scale national campaign. This time, it wasn't just a protest, it was a bid for power. The Conservative Party, already struggling to hold its pace, watched its right flank crumble. Rishi Sunak's muted responses and vague condemnations did little to reassure voters. In fact, each time he spoke of balanced immigration, Reform's online following surged by thousands. Tory MPs, desperate to keep their seats, began informally adopting elements of Reform's rhetoric. In Essex, one MP openly supported relocating migrants to Lib Dem areas, calling it necessary rebalancing. Voters saw through the desperation. Reform wasn't just shaping the conversation. They were dictating the battlefield. The media couldn't keep pace. For every attempt by The Guardian, BBC, or Channel 4 to brand them extremist or inhumane, Reform countered with hard evidence, legal documents, council testimonies, and videos of real residents voicing support. Labels no longer mattered to the public. Results did. And Richard Tice was delivering results. Night after night, the news showed fresh images, buses arriving in Labour towns, residents confronting councillors, and Reform press conferences announcing new targets. Each headline was another blow to Labour's credibility, eroding their standing bit by bit. The backlash was massive. Voters weren't just angry, they felt betrayed. Promises of compassion, unity, and transparency had dissolved into distant virtue signaling and deafening silence when reality struck. With Reform UK expanding its reach and Labour scrambling on the defensive, Britain stood at a political breaking point. The old rules had vanished, the old parties were bleeding out, and a new force, born of frustration and sharpened by strategy, was rising with unprecedented speed. What began as a local protest over the strain of illegal migration had erupted into a national firestorm, with Richard Tice and Reform UK at the center, rewriting the rules day by day. Keir Starmer, once poised to lead Labour into a confident general election campaign, now found himself surrounded, embarrassed in public, fractured internally, and strategically outmaneuvered. His greatest threat wasn't losing to the Conservatives. It was being exposed by a party he had dismissed as a sideshow. Across the country, Labour councils were scrambling to contain the fallout as legal challenges piled up. Crisis meetings multiplied behind closed doors, and voter trust evaporated in real time. Councillors who once proudly championed refugee platforms were now facing voter revolts they never saw coming. The most devastating part? Reform UK wasn't breaking the law. They were exploiting it precisely, relentlessly, and unapologetically. Every council decision they challenged, every funding redirection, every contract termination was done by the book, leaving Starmer with no illegal act to attack and no easy way out. Neither Starmer nor the Liberal Democrats can stop what's unfolding. They can only endure it. With more Reform UK candidates stepping into the political arena, the message is unmistakable. The era of distant, elite-driven policymaking is ending. Reform UK has exposed the rot decisions made in polished Westminster offices, disconnected from the realities faced by ordinary people. And voters have noticed. This isn't just a shift, it's a seismic realignment. For the first time in decades, many feel genuinely heard, not through hollow promises or polished speeches, but through action. That's what's sparking panic in the establishment. Behind the scenes, Nigel Farage's silence grows louder by the day, making his return feel inevitable. Whether he re-emerges as leader, strategist, or kingmaker, his presence will amplify the shockwaves. Richard Tice has built the foundations, but Farage is the one who can tear it all down and rebuild from the ground up. The timing is calculated, the momentum unstoppable, and the public hunger for disruption unmatched. Starmer can no longer hide behind vague rhetoric or crafted sound bites. The crisis has moved from television screens to his very doorstep. Refugee slogans, media platitudes, and backroom deals have collapsed under the weight of reality, leaving Reform UK standing amid the wreckage saying, "We told you so." We are watching the most aggressive political shakeup in modern British history. A movement once dismissed as fringe, now forcing the nation's two biggest parties into chaos. Labour is collapsing under the strain of its contradictions, while the Conservatives are frozen by their own divisions. Cowardice, meanwhile, is nowhere to be found in Reform UK. They are moving ahead with greater volume, precision, and determination than ever before. The question now is no longer whether their momentum will continue, but how far it will carry them. Will they remain a disruptive outsider, or evolve into the dominant force shaping Britain's political future? And as the storm gathers, the spotlight turns to Keir Starmer. Can he withstand it? Or has Richard Tice permanently redrawn the political map? One thing, at least, is certain. The landscape is changing.